What's the number?
They said it was the link to the book review. The link to the book review.
Who is that?
It's his last name is Gata.
H-A-T. Nehemiah
And
Gata.
he says, Kephas, where's the link to the book review?
Is it a text?
It's a messenger on Facebook.
Can you?
I think he means where's the line.
Yeah. No, it doesn't matter. I am already live by now. No.
Can I get like the top of your computer in?
No, you don't have to. I am live. I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining me this evening for a debut of my book. I know it is such an odd time in the day to be inviting people to have a conversation about my book. But what I want to do tonight is give folks an opportunity to be able to send questions that I can be, for those that have already bought the book and have read it, you can be able to send question and then I'll be able to comment on it in real time. Otherwise, this will be another opportunity for me to be able to share with you and introduce you to this book and tell you more about why and how did I arrive at writing a book on peacemaking. The fact that numerous peace treaties have failed or have collapsed serve to show how difficult it is to transcend the circle of violence. And in so doing, the one place that one could be able to look for answers about how to move forward is within the peace of the faith communities. And oftentimes the faith communities itself is it's embroiled in all kinds of violence. But I believe that the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is embodied in it is the message of peace. And so this book is for people who believe that the gospel is a message of peace. And this message of peace is relevant for our time and for this generation. Peacemaking for me is the core of the Christian gospel. Because when we miss the essence of the gospel message, when we miss the essence of making peace in the gospel, we find it difficult to be able to reconcile every other part of the gospel. Because outside of the gospel, the peace that Christ has called us to proclaim, to live, and to be, and to do, then what else have we got? And so, just as you know, we have to learn how to feed the hungry people. As a little boy, your parents or your little child, your parents often take you to when they're doing some community service, which all of us do one way or the other by inviting our kids to go out for community service and outreaches with us. So just as we learn how to feed our neighbors, and just as we learn how to care for the needy, we can learn how to be peacemakers. Because the interesting thing about peacemaking is it doesn't just fall on our laps. Uh, we know scripture tells us that we are born with all kinds of challenges. We have all kinds of challenges that we're born with. Being born in this fallen world, but in the inside of us, God has instilled a desire, a longing in us to be able to be peacemakers. But unless we learn to cultivate that soil of peacemaking in our midst, we will find it difficult to actually practice peacemaking. So I write this book for people like you and me that are desperate to cultivate a behavior, an attitude, a way of life that peacemaking becomes the dominant theme that runs through our life. So, my hope is that this book will serve as a guide that will offer a scriptural guide, a scriptural path for those that are seeking. And not just offer a scriptural path, but that this book will offer you with stories that are relevant, that when you contextualize the gospel in the context that you are in, you will see the difference that it will make. So this book is about practical peacemaking. This book is about a relevant peacemaking in our broken world. I hope that readers like you uh, will find it challenging by the scripture and by the stories to be able to reimagine where is your own story in the grand scheme of things. How do you fit in? How can you be a peacemaker in your own neck of the wood? Because we all have been called to be peacemakers. So I arrived at writing this book for that reason. But how did I arrive at writing this book? I will share a little bit about the title. The title is The Highest of All Mountain. And it comes from my understanding of reading from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 2, and I'll read from verse 2 to verse 4, and I'll encapsulate where the theme and the title of the book come from. Even though I did unpack it in the third part of the book, which I'll come to shortly. But in the last days, the prophet Isaiah said, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his path. The law will go out from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes. For many people, they will beat their swords into plowshare, and they will their spears into pruning hook. So the overarching vision that the prophet Isaiah saw of last days, a mountain of the Lord being elevated. And in this mountain of the Lord being elevated, it will be a place where nations will stream to it. But then the prophet Isaiah went on to unpack how people will turn their swords into plowshare, and they will beat their swords into plowshare, and will then turn their spears into pruning hook. And the vision that the prophet Isaiah saw here is that city of peace, a mountain of peace, a mountain where nations will stream to. And I think about the world that we live in with all the conflict and the violence and the pain and the suffering, that we as the body of Christ, whether you're evangelical, reform, or Protestant, I believe that the church can set up a model of what does it really mean to be a mountain where peace is, where it becomes like a city on a hill, not in a controlling way, but a city on a hill that is able to draw people into a conversation of peacemaking. So that's kind of the general nutshell of where I am coming from with this book. And so I will take you through the three major sections in the book. Of course, the book is in three parts: part 1, part 2, and part 3. In part 1, I talk about the three conversions of Peter. It talks about the disciples' conversion to peacemaking. And I'm not going to give you all the detailed information that is contained in the chapters, but I'll invite you to go read. It talks about Peter's first conversion, which he was first called as a fisherman to be a follower of Jesus. And then in the midst of this first conversion, we see Peter wrestling with what does it mean to follow Jesus. And then Peter's conversion, the second conversion of Peter, happens when he suddenly pulled out his sword and cut off Malchus's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is towards the week of the Passion of Christ. And so, after that, Jesus rebuked him, and we see Peter came into realization of a second conversion. And that kind of, when you juxtapose that with the denial of Christ soon after that, it really led to a second conversion. But the third conversion of Peter that really stand out for me is when Peter had to come face to face with the reality of racial reconciliation, of socio-economic reconciliation between him and Cornelius, the Roman army. And so when he saw the vision that God said to him, go now to this house, and Peter wrestled with that idea of going to a Gentile's house, of he being a Jew, going to go hang out with a Roman centurion, and all of the 9 yards. So throughout this first part of the story, I juxtapose my own personal journey into peacemaking. And here's what I mean by juxtapose. As I look at the story of Peter from the Garden of Gethsemane, I realize myself that at one point in my life I have been in the I will say I often go to the Garden of Gethsemane, which we all do, where we seek to long to meet with Jesus and to hang out with Jesus. And while in the Garden of Gethsemane, what happened for me is I got my first initial conversion into a call to follow Jesus. And then my second conversion to following Jesus is the conversion to realize that I've been called to mission. And then my third conversion, as I juxtapose this with Peter, is the conversion into peacemaking. So, and I tell this story in the book in relation to how my own personal pilgrimage to peacemaking really began and took off. And so I invite you to dive through this book, and in each book, at the end of each chapter, I have a discussion question for you to process with a group, or for you to create a Bible studies out of those discussion questions. And that is why I say it is a guide for those who are seeking to be peacemakers or are already making peace. And then the second part of the book is to be conscious of our sins and the commandments and the pathway to peace. So in this second part of the book, I laid out a little bit of a detailed explanation of what the Old Testament law calls us to do. You know, that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But really, and is it really, what did Jesus say? Jesus said, I have not come to condemn the law of Moses, but to fulfill it. And we see Jesus fulfilling that law in the ways of responding to in his teaching and the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus just illustrates story after story and just paragraph after paragraph explaining what that really means, what the interpretation of this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then in the second part, I talk about the rain falling on the just and the just and the unjust. And this is in a vision for peace and looking at it through the eyes of COVID-19. By the time I was writing this chapter, I was wrestling. This was at the beginning of the pandemic, and I had just read a book by Rodney Stark on the rise of Christianity. And Rodney Stark really detailed in 153 AD how the first pandemic really ravaged the Roman Empire. And the result of that pandemic is like millions of people died. And in Rodney Stark's summary is there were Christians that stayed back in Rome, even as the elected officials ran away and left the city at the mercy of this pandemic. Christians stayed back, believers, the early church stayed back and really stayed true to the core. And they not only stayed true to the core, but they helped. And I believe that with this pandemic, there is a vision of peace that Christ calls us to. And in this vision of peace, so in the book I narrated how we can use the readiness, how we are getting ourselves ready to confront this pandemic, how we can use a non-violence approach to really not only confront this pandemic, but it can become a base for which we operate. How do we overcome the violence that is in our society? And lastly, in that chapter, I talk in the third chapter in part two. I talked about the room for righteous anger. You know, I have heard so many people ask the question, and often I began with a story of going to on a social media and seeing how Christians will rant, how people will just go off, fly off the cuff and say Jesus was angry, and so he took up a whip and like really lash out those people that are on the in the temple. Yes, granted, Jesus did that. And so in the book, I unpack what that means, where we are called to express righteous indignation. And then lastly, on the third part of the book is the highest place, which is a vision of a promised land, a vision that Isaiah saw, a vision that really encapsulate the entire premise of this book, a vision where we are able to, using the metaphor of the mountain, to go into action, to see how do you galvanize and organize your community, how do you look at the injustices that are existing, the conflict that exists in your community, how can you mobilize community group, faith group, yeah, interreligious group to address it. And I am speaking in this, even though some of the stories that are included, it includes a lot of interfaith conversation, interdenominational, interreligious conversation. But the truth is, I am coming from this conversation with my Christocentric understanding, because I am convinced that the call to which Jesus has called us, he has called us to relate. He says, Jesus says, pray, love your enemies and pray for them even that despises you. I don't see religions that are non-Christians despise. I know we might disagree, but I believe that the light of Christ shines the brightest in the midst of these situations. So I share stories in the book of how I used some of this interreligious or interfaith dialogue to bring in a radical transformation in the public school in the city of Rockford. I talked a little bit about how even through the same interfaith, interreligious dialogue, I brought a radical transformation that really helped solidify the city of Rockford's police department and the minority community. So I tell stories and juxtapose the stories with scriptural basis for doing the peace work that I do. And lastly, in the last chapter of the third part of the book, I talk about the mountaintop, the three evils, which is directly from King's sermon on the three evils that beset the American society back in the 60s. So I invite you to order this book, read it, and not only read it, but try some of the stories and write your own stories. I believe that in each and every one of you have your own narrative and story to tell. But oftentimes we limit ourselves by wondering, can my stories be able to, can I make a difference? I am convinced that we all, as followers of Jesus, can make a difference. As followers of Jesus, we are called to be peacemakers, because it says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God. And so in all of this, I invite you to read this book. I invite you to get a hold of a copy of this book, read it, and let's have a conversation, or have a small group read the book, and then you guys can have a conversation about what you're reading, and we will see. So I will open the floor now. If anyone have any question, feel free to text in your question, or yeah, I can see those texts. I see my friend Patrick Brandes. Patrick, I believe you are in Ireland. Patrick, is it Patrick and Mariette? Yes, I believe so. Thank you so much, Becca, for your comment. I hope you are able to get a hold of the book sometime soon. And so send in any questions or comment regarding what you've heard me talk about, and I will respond to it. Okay, if there's no question, I'll tell you something about that I wrote in another chapter of the book. In chapter 3, I said radical hospitality as a necessary tool. as a necessity for multicultural peacemaking. And in this chapter, I started with, "You shall treat the stranger who sojourn with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." You see, people will forget what you said, forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. That is the truth, and that is a quote from Maya Angelou. She said this: "People will forget what you say about them, people will forget what you say to them, but they will never forget how you make them feel." So, in this chapter, I unpack hospitality. I talk about I talk about Peter and Cornelius's experience of hospitality, and I talk about how our Western approach to hospitality is sort of a really polite kind of hospitality. When it comes to hospitality, many in our culture readily equate hospitality with a generic friendliness. It says, "In a way, it is like being a therapeutic nice guy who asks what uh, uh, only that we can be nice too." The result misses the essence of true hospitality. And so in true hospitality, it calls us to be radical. Thank you so much, Peter Adams from the UK, from Luton, England. It's so good to see you. Thank you for joining me. And so we are called to exhibit a radical kind of hospitality, an untamed hospitality, because our culture has reduced hospitality to just be friendly by providing the entertainment. But Christian hospitality reminds us to extend beyond entertainment. And how do we shift gears to practice this untamed hospitality? The untamed hospitality goes beyond just an invitation for coffee or to the form of hospitality we're used to. It goes to a genuine core. When we think about Abraham and Eliza, when Eliza, Abraham's servant, sought to welcome the guest in their midst, Abraham went the extra mile. And in this particular chapter, I talk about an untamed hospitality, but through a radical expression of hospitality through a church in the U.S. For those of you that have followed, in the recent years, the U.S. has witnessed an influx of refugees fleeing violent conflict in their countries and seeking a safe place. A few churches have offered their sanctuaries as a place of refuge for these immigrants. These churches and even some cities have begun restoring the image of the church as a sanctuary city, offering hospitality for those fleeing conflict and arrested by immigrant and custom enforcement, which is ICE. It's really antithesis to the Christian call to peacemaking. Because one of the core in peacemaking is when you offer a cup of cold water to somebody who is in need without expecting a payback, it shows clearly that you truly have understood what Christ is saying. Thank you so much, Rick Pahimus from Ohio. I hope that you get a hold of this book and you find some encouraging stories. I know there are stories that some of you would have seen. But again, shifting back to this radical form of hospitality, it is to the point that this church, a church in Ohio and another church in Denver, decided to turn their church into what it really means. To be hospitable, to allow the spirit of peacemaking using hospitality. And so I've got like stories back and forth in multiple different parts of the book about how we as followers of Jesus are called to radical discipleship of. And in this radical discipleship, I take it a little bit further. Our discipleship is best expressed in our peacemaking. I think it for me, I find it difficult when somebody say, I love Jesus, I am a follower of Jesus, but yet find peacemaking really difficult to practice. Then the question that I ask is, what part of the Sermon on the Mount are you not getting? Or what part of the call to be peacemakers are you not getting? Then if that's the case, you need to reimagine a discipleship. And my call with this book for the church today is to really seek peace. The fact that I began with, I said the fact that numerous peace treaties have collapsed serves to show how difficult it is to transcend the circle of violence and foster a sustained peace. The one place that one could look for answers about how to move towards peace is within the faith communities. I believe for such a time as this, the United Nations is working on ending hours to restore peace. I think the church and followers of Jesus at such a time in history, at this junction in history, we have a critical role to play. And when we play our role by becoming hands and feet of Jesus and becoming radical peacemakers and radical, in a radical way, I'm not talking about, when I say radical peacemakers, it might mean dying for what we believe in, turning the other cheek, like Jesus says. If giving your coat and when they ask you to take your coat, give them including your tunic, just to make peace. If we go out and demonstrate that, we will see cities transform. We will see, beginning with our communities will be transformed. Our cities will be transformed. Our states and nations will be transformed. I invite you to try it. And if it fails, let's have a second conversation about that. So, I'm looking out. If anyone has a question, feel free to chime in with your question. Take your question in, and I'll be more than glad to take a stab at it. Okay, since I'm not seeing any question, I'll just keep talking. So, one of the things that I did in this book is, I know you, for every chapter, I have a chapter summary. So let me summarize a chapter 4 for you, because I did speak about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the Old Testament law in a New Testament world. I said I began with the objective of our community is not incident-based. Objective. The violence of our community is not incident-based. When Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached about the triple violence of capitalism, racism, and militarism, he was speaking of a violence that was oppressive at all levels, so built into the hierarchies and system of our culture that it was nearly invisible. The violence he describes are still with us, so interwoven with us as individuals, in our communities, and enshrined in the laws of our government that they seem impossible to root out. Yet I have witnessed governments that they seem impossible. Yet I have witnessed how people of faith and committed to peacemaking can bring an awareness and bring the process of building justice and peace. Moving to South Africa, for me, a few years after the dismantling of apartheid, I witnessed how the Truth and Reconciliation process offered many people a spiritual path forward. And in this same chapter, I talk about my own life in Rockford, Illinois. I saw the East. So it took the shooting of. It took a shooting for us to begin to build bridges between the East and the West of town, across decades and chasm of segregation. So that's sort of the summary of that chapter. Then if I move, and I won't unpack it, I will encourage you to read it. Go get the book and read it for yourself. I see my friend Jim, who is my buddy in he's with YWAM here in Quebec, in Dunham, and actually going through French school. Bonjour, Jim. Ça va? So, thank you so much, Cindy Light. I see Cindy, and my friends Cindy and Terry. My first knowledge of Christ came when I spent time as a child in the home of a Christian family. Thank you, Cindy, for sharing that. So, again, like I said, I invite you to read. So in chapter 5, that's where I talk about COVID. The objective of this chapter is how to be a peacemaker when bad things are happening to all of us. COVID-19 and racial violence. There was a confluence 2019, 2020, and we saw it was in that same time frame that we see the rise of with the death of George Floyd, and we see what can we do, being acknowledged with a new awareness around the world and being called a double pandemic. I felt imp- uh, that we can, as a community of faith, help address that. And so I share a little bit how we can together respond to this kind of violence. So I see Patrick Brandes ask us a question. Is there a personal story that you can tell that evoke you to become passionate about passionate peacemaker? Yes, Patrick, I will. In the book, I actually lay it out. I lay out my own personal journey, just like I talk about the conversion of the three conversions of Peter. But I'll give you a summarized version. I grew up in northern Nigeria. I was born in Jos, and Jos is in northern Nigeria, where it is predominant. If I class it in the region that we are in a predominantly Muslim region with Christians are in the minority. So growing up, I have the awareness of the religious differences. And not only that, I grew up, and I won't give you all the detail here. I'll encourage you to go read the book. I grew up with joining Boys Brigade. And the Boys Brigade, to those that do not know Boys Brigade, I alluded to it, they will look at it as a Christian militia group. But actually, it's a core of discipleship where you are taught, it's sort of a discipline, a place where young people are trained to be godly. It is not like the Boy Scout, it is more scripture based, but scripture based from a very evangelical point of view. And so, I told that story, and as I juxtaposed that story, so the awareness of conflict had already been embedded in me. And so when I came to faith, when I had a radical spiritual encounter in my final year of college, studying social work, I immediately had a sense of call to go into mission. And in that mission, I began to work in the inner city of doing a massive work of reconciliation, reconciling runaway kids, drug addicts, and prostitutes, first to God and then to their communities and to their families. And so so I didn't know, unbeknown to me, that actually in the inside of me, I've always been passionate about peacemaking. So not until I moved to South Africa and the glaring existential reality of the separation, of the impact of what apartheid has done, had radically, I kind of was woke by what I saw happening. And so in this community in Jeffreys Bay, which is a very touristy community in South Africa. And in this touristy community, there is the black community, there is the colored community, and the white community. And the abject poverty that exists amongst in this black and colored community, and the divide that exists was so glaring that I felt that God is calling me to do something. And so, in between that time, I have come across some great people that really are proponents of peacemaking. And I will say thank God and to my friend Peter Adams, who really has God used to turn on a faucet of peacemaking in my own personal journey that it has always been there, but Peter Adams was the first that God used to point his fingers on that and say, this is the call. And so, Patrick, those are particular stories. And so from that point on, I really embraced the idea of peacemaking, and I then developed a community empowerment center in Jeffreys Bay, where it has become a place where peacemaking is the order of the day, where I brought in the white community, the colored community, and the black community, all working. But the way I embrace peacemaking, for me, peacemaking goes beyond just let's do kumbaya, but peacemaking comes with empowerment. Because what good is it if I say to you, like James will say, oh, you come, you are naked, and I say, oh, go, or you're cold, and I say, go, be blessed and be warm. For me, peacemaking means empowering the individuals that have been subjugated, that have been oppressed. Because the key to reconciliation is that we now have equal footing where we can be able to have a conversation as peers and as partners. So in that story, it empowers the minority or the oppressed communities to the point that they now have a voice. And so, moving along, I moved to Hawaii to work with YWAM, and I find myself doing a work of peace and reconciliation between the Marshallese community and Hawaiians, native Hawaiians, and all of the other foreigners that have moved into the Big Island. And the Marshallese community, without going into the detail, Patrick, is that the Marshallese community, the Marshall Islands is a community of islands that the U.S. tested hydrogen bombs in their island in the 1950s. And that has really displaced that community. And it was not until in 2000, I'm not sure of the date, so I better not start mentioning date. Not until recently, in the 2000, that the United Nations was able to get the U.S. to now allow Marshall Islands residents, if you can get yourself to Hawaii, you can live there. And so they were living on the sea of lava, basically with no basic running water, no sanitary sewer treatment, and all of this. So they have to go buy water. And so one of the things that I did was I began to advocate and work towards seeing how can they be reconciled to the society that they are in, as well as the government be taking responsibility for what they need to do to provide for them. And so that's another story. And then finally, the last story, of course, is when I got into my own personal journey of peacemaking in the city of Rockford. You'll find some of these stories, and most especially my own conversion to radical peacemaking, non-violence peacemaking, which really got finally worked in the last 10 years of living in Rockford, Illinois. And the story of Rockford, Illinois, someday I'll write an entire memoir about just Rockford, because I have long been gone from Rockford, but my heart is still in Rockford. I'm still very much connected to the city of Rockford, and I still look back and I am in conversation with the political powers that be, and the grassroots, and I'm constantly working in tandem. Even though I now live in Quebec here, but I am so much entrenched in Rockford, as though I live in Rockford. There's no week that goes by without me doing some workshop or conversation with some community leaders or civic leaders to see that the progress that has begun, that the clock doesn't stop. Let me say this. The truth is, peacemaking is an ongoing effort. Because we reconcile today does not mean that is it. We continue to work towards a progressive change. A progressive change in the sense that until we see until the radical kingdom of God is fully established, we cannot give up. So as peacemakers, we continue to unveil the kingdom of God as here and now, even though it is still a future kingdom. So I hope, Patrick, this it gives you a little bit of a glimpse for what I have, the story that will be helpful. Yes, thank you so much, Victor. Brother Victor, I miss you and your family. One of these days, when the borders are open, I'll be able to get to travel down to Wisconsin, to Illinois. The need to go out there is really, you guys are so near and dear to my heart. Okay, does anyone have any question? Thank you so much, Peter, for responding. Hey, John Sock, I see you calling in from Nigeria. Thank you so much. And by the way, there are so many. If I want to start giving credit, I'll get myself in trouble. But I tell you, every one of you that is online here has played a part one way or the other in shaping my own personal journey. Some of you have shaped my journey by just being friends and listening. Some of you have shaped by asking questions. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And it has helped me to process and to really reflect. So for people like John Sock, who probably has read all of this book because he was one of my editors, I checked in the stories with him to make sure that I'm not being crazy, that I'm not writing something out of this world. but I, as well as being an attorney, an esquire in Nigeria, and very much involved in issues of justice, and who has visited me in Rockford, Illinois, and been part of my Kenyan nonviolence training in Rockford. So, questions or comment? Oh, wow. Hey, Estera. That's so good that you can sign up. Hey, Kevin, Estera and Estera McCann, they live in England. They are my dear friends. And Marcus and Estera. Estera is from Romania. Marcus is from Nigeria. Wow. And their hospitality. They offered me a great hospitality in their home. Hi, Kevin from Jamaica. I can't wait to go. It's warm here. You can come back now, Kevin. But anyway, I can keep going on and on. Pose any question or comment, something that you want me to talk on, or kind of like really you would have wanted to hear from me. Thank you. Becca asked, how has a commitment to peacemaking affected your journey as a father and a family? Uh, Becca, I think when I think about peacemaking, I do not divorce my call to peacemaking as solely me, but God called my entire family into peacemaking. And somehow I will say this: God gave me an angelic wife, in the sense that she she's South African. She grew up under apartheid, and so her own story in itself, it's a story of peacemaking. So a combination of both of us. Even though I seem to be more of the front, the more the apostolic, the front man, but she has been there. And I will say this: I have three teenagers, and my children have embraced our journey of peacemaking in a way that that's all they know as Christianity. I have never muscled them into doing it. It's just part of who we are. Be it from our work of community transformation in Rockford, Illinois, where they are part of every single community campaign that we do. Like when I do coding or community programming, my kids are just part of helping out one way or the other. So it has been a part of our journey and a part of our family. So it has shaped us to look at the gospel, and coupled with the fact that I am a member of the Church of the Brethren, which is the Anabaptist and Pietist tradition. So, which the core of peacemaking is the centrality of the teachings of Jesus, and the peacemaking of Jesus is the central core of our understanding of the gospel. So, my kids understand the gospel from a very peace theological perspective. And they've been part of all the camps. And in our denomination, once you get used to the peace, the radical pietist and the Anabaptist way of doing things, it becomes just part of how you live your daily life, seeking a life of reconciliation. I hope that is helpful. Oh, sorry, Patrick. I had said Patrick was in Ireland. No, they are in Paisley, Scotland. Thank you for correcting that. I appreciate that. Uh, and Patrick and Mariette did their DTS in Jeffreys Bay in South Africa, I believe in 2001 or 2002. I'm not sure. But it was great. I remember this couple so dearly, all having a strong heart for the Lord. Um, okay, I see Kevin Hall from Rockford. Hey, Kevin, thank you for the update. I'm glad to hear that Rockford Community Church is offering its place to continue the work of peacemaking in the city of Rockford. That's good news. So, any question or comment? I will want to actually. You might have a question about peace or conflict transformation that maybe has nothing to do with my book. I'll be willing to take a stab at it if I am able to, and if I, yeah. Okay, thank you for this beautiful question. How have you handled criticism from other Christians who believe peacemaking is periphery to the true gospel? I, and because of my radical approach, I feel sometimes I feel like I live as though I am a duck that the water never sits on its back. And for the sake of, for lack of a better metaphor, I use that because my journey into peacemaking is an entire lifespan. So I have come a long way from, from growing. My personal story of growing up in a society that is divided has really helped shape my perspective. That I never have time to really process when people think peacemaking is not a true gospel. Or sometimes I even hear comments to add to that comment. They say all these peacemakers are just this bunch of liberal social gospel people. And I really want to, I often respond by, when you think about peacemaking, when you think about the ministry of Jesus, when Jesus was out and about doing ministry, there were two groups of people that were following him. The one group is the Pharisees, who really, literally, they think they know, they have all the answers. And then we have the prostitutes and the tax collectors, who are just desperate for every ounce of hope that is coming out of the mouth of Jesus. So instead of focusing my attention on those that claim that the true gospel has no peace, that peacemaking is just a periphery, I share with them on the radical impact to which the gospel of peace, to which Jesus preached, is alive. And that is why the gospel that we have today is as a result of people that understood Jesus' invitation to the down and the out, those that are considered reject in society. And once their life gets radically transformed, they became the carriers of this gospel. So I respond in a way that instead of creating more tension, I just diffuse the tension by pointing them to the teachings of Jesus. And if you can disprove the teachings of Jesus to me, then I don't know what else, because it's not about doctrines or dogmas that the church preaches. It is the simple, let us go back to Jesus as the center. And if we go back to Jesus, Jesus answers all of the questions. So I hope I touched on that question. Any question or comment? And again, I am not afraid of having a conversation with people that don't believe like me. Because, and that is why I think one of the strongest key to peacemaking is we will have to be intentionally involved in interreligious dialogue. And interreligious dialogue does not mean that silence my Christian conviction. Interreligious dialogue does not mean that Christ is it's that Jesus is not the center of what I do. The centrality of what I do is hinged on Jesus. And so for me, because of that hinging on Jesus, I'm so convinced that the radical message of Jesus, when lived out in its true form, it compels us to be peacemakers. It does not compel us to be people that walk around with a bunch of propositions as if we know the answers. But we allow the Holy Spirit, through the message of Christ, to bring conviction. And that does not mean I don't say what I believe in. It is obvious when I have those conversations, I make people know clearly I'm coming from a very Christocentric point of view. So whatever conversation I have, I might have my own biases. And my own biases comes from my Christocentric conviction. And so I use that and I make it clear. But I love, because I'm convinced about my Christocentric conviction, I am willing to engage in conversation with people that I disagree, that maybe disagree with me or I disagree with, and still see them as human, and still see humanity in them. They still see that they are created in the image of God, just as I am created in the image of God. And if we can give each other that grace, the radical tendency is it makes people reimagine, why is this Jesus follower radically different from those that walk around with a baseball bat Bible? Because some of us moves around with our Bible as a baseball bat, smacking people in the head. Have you heard about Jesus? Smack. Have you heard about Jesus? Smack. Without even having a conversation. So I invite people into a conversation with me and with Jesus. I'm not the center of the conversation. Jesus is the center of the conversation. I happen to just be an instrument in that conversation. So, any question or comment? Okay, lastly, I'll read, I'll read a paragraph on doing reconciliation. And it is in one of my chapters that's titled From Policing the Community to Community Policing. This is actually a radical story, an excerpt of our study of Rockford. Maybe I'll see if I can just read a little bit more from the beginning. So I began by, before the racial uprising which led to the formation of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was partly a reaction to the killing of young black men by police officers who purportedly were keeping and maintaining law and order. The conversation on community policing was more about policing the community rather than community policing. However, the concept of community policing is not new. Community policing philosophy has always been around. It is the philosophy that works at promoting organizational strategies that support the systemic use of partnership and problem-solving technique that are proactive to addressing any condition of public safety such as crime, social disorder, and fear of crime. Community policing is about integrating police departments more closely with the communities they serve. Residents and neighborhood groups are given a seat at the table to participate in developing enforcement strategies and goals. At the same time, relationships are established and partnerships such as local government, non-profit, and community health centers, which strongly require individual officers to become involved with the neighborhood groups, including providing extrajudicial responsibility. Community policing has its root as a set of principles set out by Sir Robert Peel, the UK Home Secretary, who created London Metropolitan Police in 1822. So fast forward, in this particular chapter, I really expound on the challenge that faces Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter. The question is not which life matter, but is that how do we do policing in a way that is ethically correct? How do we do policing in a way that is honoring to minorities and in a way that they have a voice at the table? So I unpack how I got my city, the city of Rockford, to move from policing the community to community policing model. And so in this particular chapter, you'll find a little bit of a story that tells these are some of the steps that I took to get the police to reimagine community policing. And I tell you, it is not a one-day affair. It took me 5 years to work with the police department to get them to the place that they agreed to try a segment of one part of the society, of the city, to try community policing. And the moment they tried it, it has become like when you try something and you become hooked on it. The city of Rockford is hooked on community policing. There is no any other way. There is no turning back. The city of Rockford has been able to go from community policing policing the community to geographic policing, and that, as a result of that, we have seen more integrated relationship between the community and the police, and they've gone a step ahead. And not just only doing that, we have neighborhood community engagement, we have a residency officer, community keeper, which is a police officer that lives in the neighborhood, and their role is not because of policing the community, but they are like any neighbor with their name and with their phone number on their yard where you can call them as a mediator. So when there's a conflict between neighbors, the police, who is a member of the community, becomes a part of it. But this does not just happen out of a vacuum. It happens when somebody becomes intentional about saying, how do we move our police department from policing the community to community policing? So I talk about that in this particular chapter. So lastly, what I'll read is I'll read a paragraph about doing reconciliation. As Christ reconciled humanity to God, the church proclaims and embodies the ongoing story of God's reign revealed through Christ. If Christians then are called to be ambassadors of reconciliation, the church has to be involved in an inward and outward journey of reconciliation. The African concept of Ubuntu, humaneness, is particularly compelling, described by Desmond Tutu as a person with open availability to others, affirming of others, and does not feel threatened by others. So the religious dual legacy in human history regarding peace and violence calls Christian disciples to be intentional in resolving conflict as it arises, as taught by Jesus in Matthew 18. Friends, doing reconciliation calls us to be Jesus' hands and feet in our communities. So I'll stop talking now and see if there's any comment. Thank you, Peter. I agree with you. The point of the importance of interreligious discourse is so important because interreligious dialogue is key. And I tell you, when an imam or a rabbi is able to have a conversation with me, and we sat down and have tea, and he asked me, why are you not forcing me to convert before you have a conversation with me? At that point, I know a relationship has been breached. So, try it. I guarantee you, God will not let it fail. So we have about 3 more minutes left for this call. So any last comment or question? Okay, seeing none, I will close with this, with another reading. Reconciliation is truly a journey, not a destination. It is a process that leads to personal, spiritual, social, and systemic transformation. And it is a mystery that can only be discovered. So in a nutshell, reconciliation is a non-linear process for measuring progress. Reconciliation is experienced through different phases in one's life. But the lack of a metric for success makes it all the more fulfilling with an aha moment once that is experienced. Reconciliation is experienced. It does not have a linear process to which you can say point A, point B, point C, but when you experience reconciliation, it leads to an aha moment. It leads to an epiphany. It leads to that moment, such as Paul will say, is that when he got smacked on the road to Damascus, he said, "Is that you, Lord?" It is an experience that once you've tested it, you will never want to go back. So in my personal journey, I have arrived at the following fundamental skills to stay the course, to continue to gather information, reflect on those information, build community, continue to develop a listening skill, continue to develop a problem-solving skill, and seek reconciliation always. Friends, I am indebted to you for your time from all the different time zones. Some of you, it's in the middle of the night. Some is uh, still in the early part of maybe afternoon. I not enough. Please, when you get a hold of this book, go ahead, read it, and send in comments or questions, and I'll be more than glad to have a conversation. Or if you want to, you can shoot me an email, or track me down on Facebook, and we can have a personal conversation on this book. And lastly, next Sunday, I will be at Nick Padla is hosting an open forum where we'll be discussing this book. Nick Padla and I were seminary buddies. Nick Padla has written he wrote, his first book was written about 15, 20 years ago about Wilson and, no, Jim Crow law and the Wilson administration, the impact of the Jim Crow law in times of President Wilson, and many more other books. And so I look forward to, if you are able, is next Sunday, you will see the announcement coming out from me again. So thank you very much, friends. And I want to say you have a blessed evening, and God bless you. Bye.